Hey, welcome everyone. Hope you all were able to grab some lunch. Thank you so much for joining us today at Duke University's office in DC. My name is Carrie Lynn Schul. I'm co-director of the Duke program on climate-related migration. And our program aims to serve as a cross-disciplinary platform that brings together researchers, policymakers, practitioners, to really look more deeply at this interconnected nature of climate change and human mobility. We're very grateful to Duke's Office of Global Affairs for supporting our program and for making this panel possible today. So this past April, last year, the Duke program on climate-related migration hosted a full-day conference on climate change and migration, and we covered a wide range of topics, from big data to climate adaptation, immobility, human rights law. And today we really want to zoom in with this panel on a specific context, and that's really the challenges of displaced persons, whether internally or externally, and more specifically, the conflict climate displacement nexus. So in 2023, more than 110 million people were displaced globally, but less than a quarter, just 24 million, fall under UNHCR's mandate as formal refugees. As we all know, the refugee regime was created a long time ago for a very different era, very different circumstances that were specific to the post-war context. And in the decades since, we see new drivers of displacement: fragility or even collapse, environmental disasters, different forms of livelihood failures. And meeting these challenges really stretches the global refugee regime in some ways beyond its original mandate and capacity. So when Alexander Betts introduced the term survival migration, he was highlighting that a large number of migrants are fleeing their homes because they're deprived of basic rights, whether basic liberty, security, or subsistence, and yet they don't qualify as formal refugees. And meeting the challenges of survival migration, of this broader concept of displacement, is one of the more pressing issues of our time. So when Betts introduced this concept of survival migration, this was very much in the context of international migration. But the challenges of displacement are really magnified when we look at internally displaced persons as well. Far more people are displaced within countries than actually cross national borders. It was 62 million in 2022. And many displaced populations continue to have to navigate a complex web of environmental challenges, conflict, and livelihood-related constraints. And an unknown number, because we're not really measuring it, are not fleeing. Some are committed to staying in their place, despite facing significant duress, while others may be trapped by conflict or environmental related constraints and can become displaced in place. What is clear is that the conflict climate and displacement nexus is very complex, and that durable solutions require new levels of collaboration between states, between international organizations and local organizations and civil society. So our panel today will really focus on the need for more comprehensive and multidimensional frameworks and responses to address the root causes of displacement and to enhance the well-being of already displaced populations. We'll also think through to what degree the international refugee regime can and should stretch to address climate-related displacement. I'm very grateful to each of our panelists who's agreed to be here today. I'll briefly introduce each of you before I hand the floor over. Maria Giannoni is currently a senior economist in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank. She's currently global lead for the Global Solution Group on distributional impacts of fragility and conflict, and for the real-time monitoring of welfare initiative. She's led analytical work and operations on statistics, poverty and inequality, and household risk management in the Latin America and the Caribbean, South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa regions. Maria will speak a little bit more directly to forcibly displaced populations in this context and more comprehensive strategies to enhance their well-being. Mara Revkin joined Duke Law faculty in 2022. We're very grateful to have her from Georgetown University Law Center, where she was a fellow at the Center on National Security and the Law. Her primary research and teaching interests are in armed conflict, peace building, transitional justice, migration, policing, and property, with a regional focus on the Middle East and Africa. And today, Mara will present ongoing research with IOM in the context of South Sudan, particularly with forcibly displaced populations, among others, and what it really looks like to try to develop more multidimensional assessments and responses to support displaced populations. And last but not least, Alice Farmer is a visiting research fellow at Oxford's Refugee Studies Center. She will be developing a book on climate migration, gender, and laws around forced displacement during her time there. Ms. Farmer is also a senior advisor to the Bromley Charitable Trust, a private foundation that works at the nexus of climate change and human rights. Until January of this year, she was the legal officer and head of the legal team for UNHCR's office in the United States. And so Alice will help us think through how to think about UNHCR policy, programming, and broader policy frameworks, how they can and should adapt to meet the challenges of forced displacement and particularly climate-induced displacement. So in terms of format, each speaker will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. Feel free to ask clarifying questions at the end of each presentation, but if we can save our more substantive questions for the end, then we'll be sure that we have enough time for everyone. Go ahead, Maria.
Well, thank you very much. It is my turn.
Yes, do you have a PowerPoint?
Yeah, I have a PowerPoint. Maybe
Okay.
connecting somebody. But while it displays, I would like to say, well, the work that I do, my team is very focused. We're a bunch of macroeconomists, and our focus is very much on the data ecosystems, improving data ecosystems, and doing analysis that help us bridge this nexus between, the evidence that is generated and the actual programs and policies that are being designed within the bank, but outside as well. So I will share a couple of things that we've been doing and our focus, hopefully to help with the discussion. I won't get into many details, but there are links in the presentation in case you want to dig deeper. So I think what we've been doing in this global solutions team is trying to understand for displacement from a development lens. And as it was discussed, I'm not going to repeat by Daniel, by Kelly, this is an issue that is not going away. It's becoming more and more relevant when we think about development and when we think about eradicating poverty. When we look at where extreme poor are concentrated, the large majority, even the projections, are going to be concentrated in fragile, conflict, violent states. And so that's becoming extremely relevant. One thing to notice is not only that the movements are increasing, many people are being forcibly displaced, is that these events, the length of these events is becoming long, they are becoming protracted events. So we really need to think about strengthening the connection between the humanitarian approach and the development approach. And in terms of climate, this is becoming increasingly important. Just to make one example, if we look at the evidence from the last 15 years, just from the onset of extreme climate events, about 300 million people were displaced. So in a way, the work we are doing can be very easily framed within the work that the WDR presented. The WDR of migration, I think you may be familiar with it, has a very nice way of articulating the different rationales, motivations for migration, explaining where forced migration fits. So our work within this big framework, it's at this idea of the match, right? So when we have forcibly displaced populations, we know that their motives is force, they are pushed to move. But in a way, when we think about inclusion or development policies, we need to think about where they are arriving, where they are, where the expectations to return, and understand that process, that those gaps to actually inform policies. And that's where we've been working quite a bit, because when we look at the data ecosystem, there has been huge improvements from the humanitarian side. So this is just, the graph, it just shows the number of microdata sets. In the UNHCR World Bank microdata libraries only. And you can see a huge increase, which is great news because these data are very useful to inform the humanitarian response for the rapid monitoring of shocks. Although those tend to be more focused on refugees than IDPs, but I think significant improvement. But when we want to think about inclusion policies, development policies, and this match, we really need to think about a very different data ecosystem where we can actually see the forcibly displaced and the hosts together in a representative way. And that's what we've been trying to do. And here I'm going to share our recent effort in harmonizing a set of databases that have that information. So in the past, let's say 5 to 10 years, we've been investing with the statistical offices in including displaced populations in their national surveys. In some cases, more success, in some cases, maybe not. But I think there's an effort to do this process of integrating data. And building on these initial efforts, we built what we call a harmonized data with the idea of, in a way, on one hand, regrouping on what we know and being able to provide a comparative profile for displacement across different settings. So the database that we have completed recently includes, for now, 10 countries, but they cover very important displacement processes from the 2015 to 2020. The Syrian refugee crisis, Venezuelans, Rohingya, and Sub-Saharan Africa. All these surveys were designed to be representative, and there are many innovations in how you do that because that's not trivial. When you have people moving and trying to quantify them, it takes quite a bit of effort. So if you dig into we can talk a bit more about the sampling frames and how we did that. But the nice thing about that is that comparative profile that helps us, in a way, articulate things that we know at the country level. So for instance, from this analysis, we can see that across settings, displaced households are more deprived than their local counterparts in almost every aspect. But then when you start looking at the gaps, there is quite a bit of variation. So you see, for instance, that for the Venezuelan displacement crisis, the process is quite different. It's led by males, young males, whereas when you look at the other displacements processes, you see more like female-led, younger kids in these demographics. And so those gaps also are clearly more stronger when the countries are poorer or when you are comparing hosts and refugees, for instance, in camps. So all that, even though it's global, it's simple, you can start seeing some of these nuances that are quite important. The other thing that was quite interesting, it was linking that information with the legal frameworks, because then you can start seeing these associations. And with always, this is not causal. We see a very strong link between more liberal environments and better outcomes in terms of higher employment, education, particularly for women. But again, our analysis starts showing some differences that are quite interesting. I'm not going to get into those now. The other element points to this idea of a broad perspective to welfare. Sometimes we focus on specific dimensions. And let me give you an example with monetary poverty. The World Bank tracks the SDG 1 on monetary poverty. We care a lot about that. But in contexts where people cannot move, people cannot work, this type of unilateral measures or outcome-based measures may be very misleading in terms of understanding their welfare. So just for instance, when we compare Rohingya displaced in Cox's, and you look at the caloric intake, it's very similar. Actually, they're even doing better. But why is that? Because humanitarian response has been effective in meeting their food needs. But then when you compare other outcomes like employment, access to education, the gaps are huge. So this broader holistic perspective is very important and is becoming more important when we start thinking about this nexus with climate. Because, and so let me just, I'm taking too much time. So in terms of nexus with climate, what we're trying to do in terms of the data landscape is first map the hazards, the variety of hazards across the world, then try to compute who is exposed to those different hazards, let's say flood or a drought, okay, who is likely to be impacted. But what is important when we think about displacement is what is the coping adaptation capacity. And for that, again, we need this broader perspective on how we measure welfare. We need to understand not only their ability to diversify incomes, their ability to access social protection, financial inclusion in terms of their ability to smooth, etc. And in that sense, we need to think very carefully how that migration decision is made, because there is a whole, let's say, spectrum of migration decisions related to climate. We may have people who may anticipate some of the things and start deciding to move before, others that will be more forcibly displaced. So the question is, how do we think migration as a coping strategy and as an opportunity? And what other types of things that can invest in adaptation can help minimize the chances that this migration is forced with potentially negative outcomes. So I've stopped there, but then I can follow up with the discussion. Let me know if you have any questions.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much to Carolyn and Matt for organizing this event and including me. It's really always a privilege to be in conversation with practitioners and to try to make what we do in academia hopefully a little bit useful to everyone working on these issues on the ground. So I'm going to be presenting on a project I'm working on actually with a big interdisciplinary mixed methods research team, including Carolyn and also Anjali Palmquist and Gabriela Levy in the audience with us, to study the concept of fragility in South Sudan. This is a partnership between Duke University and the International Organization for Migration that grew out of some previous academic partnership work I've done with IOM in Iraq. And I'll just talk through today sort of the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish with this study, what we see as some of the big challenges and open empirical questions in this line of research, and then some next steps for the study. So, okay, so we are trying to operationalize with this study the concept of fragility as defined by the OECD as a combination of risk factors that societies experience and their ability to cope with these risks. And similar along the lines that, that Maria was just discussing. And this is a concept that's become increasingly of interest to the World Bank and UN agencies in countries that are emerging from conflict, like South Sudan, like Iraq, as the UN, the level of funding for emergency humanitarian assistance declines, what other frameworks provide mechanisms for supporting development, supporting state building and capacity building so that sovereign states in these contexts can become self-sufficient and provide peace and security for their populations with a reduced UN presence over time. So our two big research questions here are first, so we're looking specifically at a context that is very affected by displacement. So how do different dimensions of fragility, we look at 6, environmental, societal, economic, political and legal, social and economic, how do these interact with displacement? And then a second research question, which is more applied and trying to, with the purpose of providing some evidence-based guidance to IOM and other humanitarian organizations and development organizations on programming, is what are the most promising interventions being implemented on the ground currently in South Sudan? How do populations, the beneficiaries of these interventions perceive them? What do beneficiaries think? What kinds of recommendations do beneficiaries in South Sudan have for possible sort of improvements to current programs or future programs? So our context is South Sudan, which is one that we think is understudied relative to its enormous importance and interestingness as the youngest country in the world. It has only been gained independence in 2011, is about to undergo its first democratic elections, hopefully later this year, has enormous levels of poverty and challenges of food insecurity, with an infant mortality rate of 1 in 10 children who will die before the age of 5. More than 50% of the population is experiencing acute levels of food insecurity. 40% of the population is displaced both internally and externally as refugees to other countries. And according to the UN Environmental Program, South Sudan is one of the 5 most environmentally vulnerable countries in the world, experiences very severe episodes of alternating drought and flooding that contribute to the persistent subnational conflict that continues to occur despite the formal end of the civil war in 2018. So since that time, we have not seen, there's been very little implementation of a lot of the transitional justice and other mechanisms specified in the 2018 peace agreement. So very high levels of fragility across all 6 of the dimensions that we're looking at. At the same time, IOM and other NGOs on the ground in South Sudan are implementing a number of different programs that are trying to get at different dimensions of fragility. Just to give a couple of examples that we're interested in here. So there are community dialogue programs bringing together civilians with the intent of trying to build trust and social cohesion in areas that have been affected by conflict. There are also efforts underway to develop adaptations to climate change that also might have other positive externalities for communities. So IOM has a floating gardens project that uses as a way of sort of farming in areas that are very severely impacted by flooding, and also has positive externalities for economic empowerment of women and a reduction in gender-based violence. Also, another area of work that we find very interesting is efforts to formalize and codify customary law and bring it more into alignment with South Sudan's constitution and official legal framework. So this gets to, actually, Daniel had mentioned that a major challenge in a lot of these contexts is increasing conflict between herders and farmer populations. And some of that is driven by conflict. It's also sort of a property law issue and an issue of sort of what are the relevant legal frameworks and how secure our property rights in these contexts. So these are a few of the programs that we're looking at. Fragility, this group, many in this group probably have spent more hours trying to figure out what fragility is and how to measure it than I have. Challenging concept. We are still working on developing measures of fragility through a household level survey that will collect data at the individual level. We're going to then try to aggregate up from that to the county level and try to then link that with some other national level indicators of fragility we have, including from OECD, which is looking at really sort of macro level census type indicators like mortality rates at the population level and GDP. But we are really taking this to the individual household level and trying to understand, based on sort of individual experiences and attitudes in communities that are affected by fragility, how South Sudanese people are perceiving these different dimensions of fragility. Results, we conducted a pilot survey last summer with a sample of around 1,600 respondents, 400 across 4 different counties, all experiencing to varying extents different fragility challenges, some more affected by environmental challenges like deforestation and flooding, and others more affected by political and security fragility. And we piloted this index tool to try to develop a fairly simple, just additive index that allows us to sort of rate communities on a scale of fragility, where darker colors on this grid here indicate higher levels of fragility, and lighter colors indicate lower levels of fragility. And in theory, this kind of a tool could be helpful for targeting programming in a way that's modular and directing it toward areas that are most in need of a particular program. So we have actually, I should say, vertically, the different dimensions of fragility are up and down, and the county's locations are going to the left. So we can see a little bit here that an area with greater environmental fragility up here is one where potentially this type of tool could be used to help identify areas that are more in need of a particular kind of programming and perhaps less in need of others. To try to facilitate modular programming and not sort of one size fits all interventions for these communities. So based on the pilot, we learned a lot of lessons and are working on implementing another survey later this spring, making some changes, adding human security as a 6th dimension of fragility, one that was most recently added to OECD's tool index and concept. And we're also making this, we've realized that this is a context so complex that it really requires highly interdisciplinary mixed methods team. So we've expanded our research team to include anthropologists, sociologists, people working on environmental issues and conflict, and really excited about collecting not only quantitative household survey data, but also qualitative evidence from interviews and focus groups. And we hope that this second survey will provide some guidance or suggested evidence that will help us then potentially design a randomized evaluation of an IOM or other NGO program. So just last here, just last minute on sort of some open questions. So in general, measuring fragility is really challenging. These different dimensions, environmental fragility, political, societal, they are not really comparable. And so if you have sort of an index that allows you to determine that, there's your level of 70 on the fragility index for environment and political legal fragility in these two communities, it's sort of like comparing apples and oranges. So we're really trying to think through how to actually better conceptualize and compare across domains, and how to also link different levels of analysis. So we're collecting individual household survey data. How can we make that useful to more aggregate national level data that OECD and other organizations are interested in? And I will, so yes, that's a little bit about our project and next steps, and would love to hear any questions or comments on this. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Mara. Any clarifying question? Okay, you guys are doing great on time. Al, over to you.
Hi, thanks. So I've spent some portion of the last couple of years working with UNHCR on how we think about the legal framework, the international legal framework when it comes to climate change and refugees. So that's what I'll speak to a little bit here. I think the opening observation is that, as I think some of the panelists have referred to, a lot of people are displaced internally, right? And so when we look at the refugee definition, we are talking about cross-border migration. It's going to be very interesting to see the degree to which internal displacement becomes cross-border migration as climate change continues. So this is one of the reasons we've been thinking through this. So a lot of my conversations here will focus on some of the work we've been doing at UNHCR, looking at case law across different countries that adjudicate refugee cases, right? So at a base level, I don't know how many of you have the luck or misfortune of being lawyers here. At UNHCR, in some countries, we are the adjudicating authority, and in other countries like the United States, those countries run courts or adjudicative bodies that adjudicate refugee cases themselves. And so some of our analysis has been looking both at our own determinations and what's going on in the courts in US, in Italy, in Canada, Australia, all kinds of places. So we've been thinking that it's pretty clear that people may have valid claims for refugee status under the 1951 Convention based on climate change factors. The 1951 Convention is our guiding document for refugee law globally, and it was very much written with World War II displacement in mind. So it is not actually very well suited to what's going on now. The elements that you need for a refugee claim, I'm going to look at some of them, but not all of them here. You need to show a well-founded fear of persecution. We think we see that in climate change cases, that a well-founded fear might be something around threats to the enjoyment of life, enjoyment of the right to life. So a classic example of that might be parents who say their children's fundamental right to life might be threatened by living in a small island in the South Pacific without potable water. We think we see other aspects of well-founded fear that can come up, and I can go into more details later. But I want to emphasize that well-founded fear doesn't need to be for an individual, like it can apply to a whole group of people. And that's, I think, what we're often seeing in climate displacement contexts. So then many of you also may have heard that the refugee definition requires your well-founded fear to be for reasons of one of these 5 grounds that I've listed here. In the US, the language is often on account of those grounds, but for reasons of us in the convention. And here again, we think that there are climate change factors that may help prove those elements. So some of the classic examples we've started to see are discrimination. So discrimination against, say, Dalit groups in India or indigenous groups in Guatemala, that would fit into the ground of race.
we already have seen some claims where people have been environmental activists or journalists, and the governments have tried to silence them. We would link that to a political opinion claim. And then we see a lot of claims coming up that are really interesting around specific vulnerabilities, where those pre-existing vulnerabilities have been exacerbated by climate factors, which speaks a little to the nuance that Daniel was presenting earlier. So for instance, there's a case out of Italy where they recognized a Pakistani woman as a refugee because the vulnerability of that person to disasters and climate change amplified their vulnerability to trafficking. These are the sorts of arguments that we're starting to see come before courts. So it's very interesting to see. We also require in refugee law that you are unable to relocate within your country of origin. So right, in a country as big as the United States, most refugee claims would fail on this grounds because you would be expected to move from Detroit to Los Angeles or whatever it is. With climate change, we're seeing some really interesting legal arguments come out around this question of, do you have to move internally, right? So one of the examples we've been looking at a lot lately is Haiti, where you say, look, this country is so small and so affected by climate that the realistic options for internal relocation are very slim. I think another factor that's really interesting to look at when it comes to internal relocation is the question of the temporal nature of climate change effects, right? So we've started to see some arguments put forward, not yet one, but put forward, where an indigenous person from Guatemala who's facing drought in their original home might be expected to move to another area of Guatemala. But the argument is that over time, that area, that second area of Guatemala will also become subject to the same droughts and the same climate effects. So that temporal nature of consideration when looking at whether you can relocate internally has become quite an interesting area of discussion. This is also like kind of fascinating for refugee lawyers. Like we don't usually deal with slow onset emergencies, right? And this is one of the things that makes climate factors so different when we're thinking about how to look at refugee law. I want to mention briefly that within the US, we don't follow either the Cartagena Declaration or the OAU, the Organization of African Unity's 1969 Convention, but those two regional documents apply in the Cartagena example to most of the rest of the Americas, and in the OAU example, obviously, to Africa. Both of those regional definitions of what a refugee is include language around events or circumstances that seriously disturb public order. So that's a nicer and much broader definition than on what I've got on this left-hand column here. And that's where some lawyers are starting to look to say, hey, this concept of events that seriously disturb public order, circumstances that disturb public order, is climate change one of those, or a specific disaster events around climate change, some of those. So that's the bulk of the legal work we've been doing. I'm going to take a couple more minutes, if that's okay, to talk about some of the broader work that UNHCR has been focusing on. We actually do work a lot with IOM when we're hashing out how this all works. So we've been doing a big set of work on policy and law. Like, what is it that the international legal framework says when we're out to try and protect people who are affected by these issues? I'm really glad you referred to Alex Bett's term on survival migrants. Like, who's in desperate need of some sort of protection, but outside of that legal framework that I just talked about. So we've been collaborating with some of the other UN agencies and international legal bodies to think through some of the human rights law aspects, right? Some very interesting case law coming out about the threat to the right to life, which is under the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, isn't directly connected to the refugee definition, but really maybe a way that we see protections coming forward there. And then on a more practical level, we've been seeing and working with governments that are trying to develop complementary pathways, complementary protections. So this is, the basic idea here is everything I just said about how we're looking at case law around the Refugee Convention, that'll cover some percentage of people affected by climate, but not all of them, right? So what are the complementary protections we're also looking at? Those of you in the US who have heard about temporary protective status, TPS, which is really often discussed in migration policy, that's one of those examples, right, where it's classically used for natural disasters, but if we start to reconceptualize what is a natural disaster and start to see it in the climate change concept, that's a really interesting example. The Biden government has been using humanitarian parole for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela. Climate factors in that use of humanitarian parole. But also, much more specifically, Argentina developed a special humanitarian visa program, which is very directly for people affected by what they term as socio-natural disasters, encompassing climate change. So we are starting to see some really interesting legal models that are complementary to or in addition to the refugee framework. So that's the policy and law work that UNHCR has been focusing on there. I should say that we very much see that the conflict and violence can be exacerbated by climate change, which I think is one of your points there. I'm not going to talk a great deal about the next point on operations because I'm one of our boring lawyer people and not one of our operational people at UNHCR, but we are basically trying to make sure that everywhere we operate, we are trying to set up refugee protection, including camps, in ways that are sustainable, in ways that don't do more damage to the environment, in ways that provide for disaster preparedness, when we're working with return communities, trying to do so in a way that has a premise on sustainability. So that's been some pretty interesting work. And then UNHCR and IOM and everyone is part of a program at UNHCR, at the UN called Greening the Blue, which means that within the UN, we all have to switch to being much more environmentally sustainable. Yeah. That brings me to this final observation I wanted to make, which is I think climate mobility is such an interesting area, partly because it doesn't neatly sit within any of the UN agencies. And so we work with IOM, we work with the International Labour Organization, we work with UNEP, which is the environmental program. Like there's a lot of collaboration across different UN bodies to try and figure out how best to respond to these issues.
Can I ask a clarifying question to Alice before we open it up? On the first slide, when you're talking about the 1951 convention, and am I understanding well that in a way the argument is that people who are affected by climate change can fit under this definition if the emphasis is more on well-founded fear rather than fear of persecution per se? Because I've always understood that persecution was actually this word that was limiting us within this definition.
Yes, so you're pointing to something that's a complicated, so well-founded fear is a well-founded fear of persecution. We require, like the refugee definition requires either the government to be doing the persecution or not to be doing enough to stop that persecution, right? Well-founded fear is a term that pushes us to analyze that persecution by looking forward, right? So the way that we would be constructing some of these arguments would be around the government is not doing enough to ensure that your right to life can continue. The government is not doing enough to ensure that you can control your own natural resources, that you can attain an adequate standard of living. The persecution question is a very, well, let me take a step back. Climate change by itself is probably never going to be enough to bring a refugee claim. But climate as a factor, as a tipping factor in any of these might help, right? So that's the sort of the Pakistani example I gave where the person is more vulnerable to the persecution factor of trafficking because of the climate aspect. the persecution comes from what the national government is doing in response to this massive climate problem. We will never be looking at the government that actually caused the climate problem to begin with, because that's Britain in like 1923, right? Was that helpful?
It's very interesting. Yeah, I've never really thought about that. Great. We can open up to some questions, and given that we have a short time, maybe we could gather 2 or 3 at a time and see how far we get. So yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Diane Scheinberg. I work for the UN Secretary General Peace Building Fund, and I lead on our investment on climate, peace, and security. We work a lot with IOM, HCR, in implementing this kind of portfolio in the field. So I had 2 questions. The first one is thinking and looking at prevention. So we know we have the data sets and we know a little bit what's going to come and where we can start pinpointing to some potential tensions and look at countries who we know are going to be more impacted. So how do we do more with the prevention net? And Daniel, I'm looking at you, and what's the thinking with USAID on the time frame on prevention in this agenda? And then my second question is maybe to Mara, and looking also at data and how do we use the work that you've been doing with IOM and link that with perception. And if you've been thinking also about building in with all those data sets, perception surveys that can then also help identify what communities define as when they're ready to come back, why they're leaving, and how we can use that also to monitor the impact on some of our investments. And then, maybe the third point, it's around with the prevention lens. What we are seeing is that, I don't know, country like Burkina Faso, we see where movement is going and what it means now today in terms of investment on urbanization, potential impact on social cohesion. So how do we bring also the additional partners around the table that need to think about the future of mid-sized cities, because this is where a lot of the displacement, particularly in country, is going. And it's going to have a massive impact in terms of who's living where, what it means for employment also within countries and opportunities for youth, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's all maybe.
Yeah, I have a few figure actually, just on a lot of what you noted. This idea of measuring at the community level, also social cohesion factors, not a social capital level, but that individual between individual and individual between state at that local level, because that's going to really get at resilience factors. And there's also some really interesting research on degrees of social cohesion and then the community's ability to move together, or their willingness to migrate and stick together as a unit is itself then an adaptability strategy. But when you have fractured social cohesion, especially in these post-conflict settings, then you won't see that unity of effort towards moving in a common goal, literally moving and also moving figuratively towards a common goal.
Thank you. Let's take one more question in the back and then we'll let you respond.
Yeah, I'm very curious to.
Can you introduce yourself?
So I'm Diana Campos from CDA Collaborative Learning, also an MIDP alumni. So I'm very curious to know if you have researched what are the factors for resilience that communities have in order to thrive in these challenging times. And also kind of when you talk about relocation sounds like a solution for a big problem, but itself it's a problem that creates conflict. And so maybe you can explain us or give us a big picture of if you have a strategy for conflict reduction within these relocation strategies. So that's it.
That's great.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe I'll talk a bit about how I was thinking when we formed different projects, in the bank. So I think the bank is, as you know, has a new vision that is trying to expand his role into tackling climate change. And And I think this has been also a lot of thinking on what that means for operations, right? And some of these trade-offs that you need to think about, right? So how you invest in vulnerability while also minimizing impacts on climate, etc. So I think there is a lot going on, but I think on the technical side, there are many opportunities and things that we're thinking, which is there is the opportunities that big data, geospatial data, and all these sources of information give us an opportunity to actually start mapping much more in detail where some of the risks are, for instance. And this is something that we're trying to advance the agenda on. And so when you start mapping these hazards and where people are, you can try to start identifying some of these hotspots. The other element is that even within certain hotspots, there are people can be more or less vulnerable. So if we can understand that to different degrees, that can help with the targeting. And so then you say, okay, money is limited, there are certain, risk constraints, where do you go, right? Where is likely, where should we be acting first, etc. And the third element, I think, is how do we, in a way, beyond hazards and vulnerability, is how we go a bit further in terms of anticipating and adjusting the policy response. So, for instance, there has been already some research showing that you can actually pinpoint the risks of floods. So I think there is a recent paper done by Stefan Derkon and some colleagues that are now in the bank, where you can actually identify where who will be impacted or likely impacted by floods. And then you can start, for instance, deploying cash transfers ahead of time, ahead of the flood. So this type of, combination of highly, rapid data can actually help us adapt these social protection systems. And therefore, you may not end up seeing these negative coping responses, such as cutting food consumption or even forcing people to move. But I think there is a lot we can do with new data, etc. And that's my focus, I would say. And so we need to start thinking on that connection. But definitely, the challenge is that in some of these countries, these systems are not there, right? So you could say, okay, I have the data, I know what is going to happen, but you need to have the systems to actually deploy those transfers. So one of the angles that I think is being thought is how you improve, these systems to actually give that response. So I'll stop there. Maybe that helps a bit with that.
Thanks for these great questions. I'll try to just hit a few of these. So to clarify too, I didn't do a very good job of explaining the survey the study methodology. So we actually already are doing a household level individual perception surveys. So random samples of at the representative at the county level, and then randomly selecting a member of the household, administering a questionnaire that asks questions about different indicators of fragility. So things like how much trust you have in the local government, to what extent do you have access to clean water across all of these different dimensions. So agree definitely that perception surveys can be very helpful in these contexts. On prevention and how we can use data to better identify hotspots, I think that this kind of data can also be very helpful for identifying tipping points where things are maybe about to get worse. And so surveys, I think, can be really useful for this. We have questions about sort of in this community, how much retrospective questions about changes over time. So has the amount of overgrazing in this community sort of gotten worse in the last 6 months to a point where it's creating problems for farmers and potentially sort of triggering conflicts between herders and farmers. So trying to also not only conduct longitudinal surveys, ideally with the same population at different points in time, but asking retrospective questions to try to get a sense of how different reference, how the community has changed recently. On sort of how to, factors for resilience. So in the South Sudan context, that's one where the state is very weak. And so to the extent that we're seeing resilience, it's in social cohesion, it's often coming from non-state sources of authority or informal institutions. So I think we can learn a lot from talking to and surveying communities about what sort of types of local interventions are working. And I guess the last point I'll make is that I think so this work that we're doing on fragility is trying to provide guidance on development assistance. It is a good thing that the UN has shifted focus from emergency humanitarian operations, I think, to more development assistance, but I also think there are risks that development and assistance could potentially be destabilizing if not sort of designed with concern for lots of different sort of contextual factors and risks. So for example, programs, IOMS programs to give out land grants, also sort of cash assistance to returnees, both refugees and IDPs, and how do we design those problems to not actually fuel sort of more competition or conflict between different groups. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I mean, I don't have much to add, but just to say that one of the ways in which people are not resilient is if they don't have a legal right to stay. So we have to get that part right.
Thank you. Well, we're at time. I'm sure this conversation could go on much longer. I see many people in the audience who were here last year at our conference. So thank you for coming back, some who even presented last year. And hopefully we'll have another one coming up in the coming months or next year. So thanks, and grab some food on your way out if there's any.